It is my honor to present Dr. Richard Wolff. How are you doing today, sir?
Very well, and thank you for having me on your program.
Absolutely. So what is the difference between capitalism, socialism, communism, and Marxism?
Okay, it's a fairly tall order, and I'll try to make it as clear and concise as I know how. Capitalism, socialism, and communism are alternative ways of organizing an economy. That's as easy a way to understand it as I can imagine. By economy, I simply mean the system we use to produce and distribute the goods and services we depend on for our lives. Our food, our clothing, our shelter, our transportation, all the things, the goods and services that make up a modern life. Those have to be produced, and then they have to be distributed so that we can consume them, whether it be a haircut or a hamburger or a software program or an automobile. Someone has to produce it, and it has to get from the producer to those of us who consume it. The capitalist system is like others in the history of the world because it organized the production in a remarkable way. It divided the people up in the production system into a minority and a majority. A small number of people who organize and run it, and a large number of people who do the work. In a way, people know this already. If you go back in history before today, you'll see that there were many systems set up like this. Slavery is a system where there is a small group of masters and a large group of slaves. The masters run the whole operation. The slaves do, if not all the work, the overwhelming bulk of the work. In feudalism, again, a small group, we call them the lords, supervise and control a very large group called the serfs, and they work in feudal manors and plantations to organize that work that way. Capitalism is like slavery and feudalism in that it organizes people into these two groups, one that runs the show and one that does the work. But unlike slavery, nobody is anybody else's property. And unlike feudalism, one of them isn't the guy who does everything in charge, and the worker is literally nothing. In capitalism, and here comes the definition, the small number of people who run the show are called employers, and the mass of the people who do the work are employees. And the way this works is the employees produce a ton of stuff, goods and services. A portion of that they get back. That's called the wage or the salary. The rest of what they produce, over and above what they get back to consume, is called the surplus, and it belongs to the employers. And they use the word profit to describe what's produced by their employees over and above what they have to give back to those employees and what they have to replace in the way of machines, tools and equipment, and so forth. All right, so that's capitalism. What's the difference between that, socialism, and communism? Let's jump over to communism as, in a way, the furthest new, different kind of system. And before giving you the definition, I should tell you that people debate these things. It isn't all cut and dry. I'm going to give you the definition that makes sense to me, but there are others, and there's an active debate about that. For me, communism, which I get from the leading thinker who pushed these ideas out, which is that Karl Marx that we're going to come to in a few minutes, the idea is simple. You change the organization of production. You don't have a minority and a majority. You don't have masters or slaves. You don't have lords or serfs. And here's the big one. You don't have employers versus employees. Instead, you make the workplace a community. And by that we mean everybody is equal. And together we decide what we're going to produce, how we're going to produce it, where we're going to produce it, and how we're going to divide up that extra that we produce over and above what we take back as our individual consumer good pile. So it's the collectivization, if you like, the communization of the production process. It means, for those who are used to this language, that the workplace becomes a democracy, a place where everybody has an equal, one person, one vote influence on the decisions. No more the owner of the business who's somebody else. No more the shareholders who are other people. No, the people who work there will together do the work of producing that good and that service. This is revolutionary. This is radical. This is a real break. It's more of a break with what went before than capitalism was relative to feudalism or slavery. Because while slavery was pushed aside and feudalism too, what capitalism did is hold on to that old division of a minority and a majority. Employer-employee isn't that big a move from lord and serf and master and slave, which is why modern employees, excuse me, often make the kind of sardonic joke, I'm a wage slave, because they understand the link there to something that went earlier. Well, what then is socialism? Well, in a way, socialism is in between. It isn't capitalism anymore, and in a certain way, it isn't communism. Let me explain. It isn't communism because it hasn't yet gone, and maybe it never will, to the point where all the decisions are made democratically, collectively, by all the workers. On the other hand, it isn't capitalism because it doesn't let the employer dictate everything to the employee. The socialist wants to limit what the employer can do to the employee. The socialist wants to protect the employees, the majority, from the profit-driven behavior of the employer. So socialists are the kind of people who push for a minimum wage, who are helpful to organize labor unions, who want to make sure that the environment is protected as capitalists make money. They don't dismantle the employer-employee, but they regulate it, and so they are as troubling to the capitalists as the communists are. The capitalists don't want limits on what they can do from the socialists, and they surely don't want to give up their power and strength in order to democratize the enterprise. And where does Marxism fit in? Marxism is a tradition of thought and action designed to go beyond capitalism and to move in the direction of socialism with an ultimate goal of getting to communism. Marx was the guy who figured out that capitalism, like every other system, is born, evolves over time, and then passes away. Slavery was born, evolved, and passed away. Feudalism was born, evolved, and passed away. Earlier economic systems were born, evolved, and passed away. Marx's argument was that capitalism is no different from any of them. It too was born, it too evolved. So the next stage, here comes the punchline, the next stage is it dies, it passes on. And for Marx, it was a good thing. Now, Marx wasn't a cheap shot guy. He didn't say that capitalism had contributed nothing. It did contribute. It learned how to technologically develop society in dramatic ways. It made poor parts of the world a good bit less poor than they had been. It didn't do that very evenly. Some became quite wealthy and all that. But Marx was more than willing to give capitalism its due. He just argued, okay, we got some of the benefits. Unfortunately, we got a lot of the defects too. And the human race, here we go, can and should do better than capitalism. And he argued there are ways of doing that. There are internal ways that capitalism breaks itself down, and we can and should start thinking along the lines of a better system that will be better for most people. And he called that communism, and said he wanted to help make that transition as successful and as minimally painful as possible. And so that's the body of thought devoted to that goal.
Before we get into specifically your new book, which is folks understanding Marxism, which is a very, very easy read. It's a quick read, and I think I told you earlier before the show, I think it's quite a dangerous book because it makes this thinking a bit too logical for many. So, but it is a very good read, and I would suggest that everybody have it. It's on our page, and likewise at Dr. Wolff's page at www.rdwolff.com. Now, one of the tenets of capitalism is somehow we would get more innovation within this system than we would in a socialist regime, or even going further in a communist regime. Is that true? Is there something inherent to capitalism that actually invokes innovation?
Well, there are things in capitalism that provoke innovation, that drive it. But there's no reason to believe that socialism would be any less successful in doing that. The argument you sometimes hear is that in capitalism, if you don't innovate, if you don't make changes, then some other competitor will do so and you will fade out of business. So there's a kind of ruthless driving of every producer to become more, quote unquote, efficient. But the problem is, capitalists have long understood this, and they have many, many ways to get around this. For example, they buy out their competitors. Then there's no one to worry about. You call that mergers and acquisitions. Right. You end up with one or two big companies, monopoly companies, we call them. And if you look at most businesses, you'll see that they started off with many companies, but over time they became a very few. The competition kind of ends itself. It ends with few companies that have bought out all the other companies, and so we don't have much competition, which is why the price of cigarettes is the same whatever company you buy them from. The price of automobiles is roughly the same no matter what you buy them from, and on and on and on, because it turns out that capitalism doesn't want the very competition it boasts about, and it has to therefore take the rap. Yeah, you're maybe innovating in the early stages, but in the late stages, you're a monopolist. You don't want to innovate anything. You just want to jack the price up, which actually prevents anyone else from getting into the business. So we've been stuck with choosing between a very small number of sellers of most of the products we now rely on, whether it's the automobile or the toothpaste manufacturers or anyone else. And socialism, I think, would be productive in a different way. In a capitalist system, it's very profitable for the capitalist to innovate, to do something new. But for the worker, there's much less incentive because the worker doesn't get much out of it. You've made the capitalist a bundle of money by figuring out how to economize on some input or how to make things work more quickly. But your salary isn't much affected by that. It's his profits. In a socialist system where everybody is equal, the incentive for every person in a workplace to come up with new and better ways to produce things is a more generally true fact for most of the people. And I think that would make it more productive, more efficient, not less.
And that is the scary argument, because if people really understood that before, I want you to tell me, why would I be wrong? And I want to go back to exactly what you said there, but there's one issue I said I had to ask you. I said that capitalism by design makes sure that mediocrity is what continues to reign. Okay, and I said the reason why mediocrity will reign is even if we decided as capitalists to give you a raise, because you have no pricing power. The only persons with pricing power themselves are the capitalists, and whatever raise they give you, they just have to price it back into their profits. Is that a true statement, or is that a false statement, or is that an irresponsible statement?
No, I think mostly that's correct. One of the reasons they fight so hard against unions is because they are in a position where they might not be able to pass on to the consumer the rising cost of their workers when those workers are militant and get a higher wage. So what do? One of the things they do is become very anti-union, viciously, hire people to intimidate workers, use lawyers to break down unions, et cetera, et cetera. Here's another thing they do. They say, let's try to get enough pricing power so that if we have to pay a higher wage, we will be able to raise the price. And the way to do that is to get rid of your competitors. Right. Either drive them out of business or buy them out of business or both. And one of the reasons you see this endless process in which many competing companies merge eventually or beat each other in competition so only a few are left is because then they have the pricing power to pass on any rising costs, whether it be for labor or materials or tools or machines, pass it on to their consumer because the consumer has nowhere else to go.
If we have a stock market that gives a return on average over years of 10%, and you have an economy that only grows at 2%, that somehow that is an unsustainable reality because what you have is folks that are enriching themselves at a faster rate than the economy is creating growth itself. Is that a true assessment or not?
Yes, it can be. It's perfectly possible. By the way, recent years have been exactly that the top 1 or 2 or 3 or 5% have been becoming richer at a faster pace than the economy as a whole is growing.
Isn't it also true that because of the delta in there, that it could actually be extractive, which means we have negative growth for certain areas within that society?
Absolutely. I was getting to that. The way that people at the top become richer faster than the average is because they're not just growing with the economy, they're also transferring wealth. They're redistributing wealth from the middle and the bottom to those at the top.
Your book is titled Understanding Marxism. Understanding Marxism is the book. First of all, why did you write that book, especially in these times? Do you think that somehow you could get traction with a book with a title like that?
Yes. The reason we wrote the book, as I was mentioning to you, is we were getting, over the last 5-6 years, literally a flood of emails, of letters, of phone calls, or I was getting invitations to give speeches or to do interviews, and all of them contained questions about Marxism. It was clear to us that there is a revival, if you want to use that word, or rebirth of interest in Marxism. Living with capitalism is living with an enormously dangerous, unstable economic system. People had gotten the idea we had figured out how to manage it, that the lessons of the Great Depression of the 1930s meant we knew how to avoid another one. Indeed, every president since Roosevelt in the 30s had promised the American people, not only will I get us out of the current economic downturn, but I will make sure that our children will not be subject. Every president promised it. No president could deliver it.
Let's continue with that. You were talking about people thinking there's a better way and that capitalism, like any other economic system, eventually goes away.
That's right. And it usually goes away when people have had enough of it, when whatever the positives it may have had are increasingly outweighed by the negatives, when too few people are benefiting and too many are suffering. So eventually the slaves revolted, and eventually the serfs revolted, and it's reasonable to expect that eventually the mass of employees will think to themselves, this is a system that may be working very well for those at the top, as it did in late slavery for the masters, and as it did in late feudalism for the lords of the manor, but it isn't working for most of us. And I think if you took a poll, as people are doing these days, of American working people, if not a majority, very close to a majority, are ready to say, this system is not working for me. It may be working for the 1%. It may be working for the conservative, the rich businessman or woman. But for the average American worker, it's becoming harder and harder to even hope that you can realize the so-called American dream. Your kids are having to borrow more and more money to get a college education that is less and less of a ticket to a good job or a good income. The problems keep mounting, and the solutions keep ebbing away. And so, yes, I think we're at a point now where people are more than interested. They're getting even, I might even say, desperate to hear what alternatives there are. What could we do to have an economic system? What would we have to do that would work better for the average person, that would solve the problems we have rather than get us depressed about the lack of a solution, so that we don't have a politics that is distracting us from fixing a broken economy by getting us all excited about immigrants or getting us all excited about Russians meddling with our election. These are distractions, whatever merit they may have, and I'm not sure they have any, but these are distractions from what is really the problem for most Americans, which is the work they do, the job they have, the income they earn. I mean, that's what we do 5 out of 7 days of every week. We go to work, we get ready before we go, we recover when we come back, we worry about it, we think about it. This is the area where we need help to get a society that works for most people. And Marxism has been the criticism of capitalism, the system we have, that's been going on for the last 150 years. It's become literally a kind of repository of the most creative thinking and the various efforts, by the way, many of which failed. So this is a process of learning by doing and trial and error to get clear how we go beyond capitalism. And it's in that spirit that this book, Understanding Marxism, was written.
Now, you state that in your book that class struggle is the unavoidable result of capitalism. And, people, I think that is something that people can see right now. In fact, I wrote a book called As I See It, Class Warfare, the Only Resort to Right-Wing Doom. So, explain that. Why is that ultimate result of capitalism that?
Sure. The basic way to explain it is this. Think with me of going to look for a job, as most people do in their lives. You find an employer, you talk with him or her, and they tell you, okay, we're hiring, we want some people to do this work or that. You talk with them and you hear what kind of work you'll do, and you go through it. You'll have to come Monday to Friday. You should be at the workplace at 8:30. You'll be done at 4:30, whatever. And then you get to that key moment, how much am I going to get paid? And here's one of Marx's great insights, something which I think most people know, but they don't quite put it into words, and we owe that to Marx. So let's say the employer and you settle on $20 an hour. Okay, so you know that every hour you're there working, your employer is going to have to give you $20. You now know what I'm going to say. The only way the employer is going to give you $20 is if the result of your labor, what you add to whatever it is that company sells, has got to be worth more than $20. If having you come for an hour adds $20 worth of stuff for him to sell, and he sells it, and he gets the $20, and he turns around and gives it to you, then what has he gotten out of employing you? And the answer is nothing.
Nothing, right.
So there has to be a difference. You have to add more value by your labor each hour than you are paid. And the difference between what you add in value to what the employer sells and what he pays you, that difference is his profit. That's what he's in business to get. The more he gets of it, the more successful he is. The faster he can grow, the easier he can protect himself against competitive moves by other companies producing what he does. So the capitalist is always interested in what? Getting more value added out of you, and on the other hand, paying you less. If you add, let's say, $30 an hour by your labor, and he pays you 20, okay, he gets the extra 10. But if he can drive down your wages from 20 to 15, his extra left over at the end goes from 10 to 15. In other words, the less he pays you, the more he keeps for himself. That's a recipe for class struggle, because what that means is that the employer is forever looking for ways to pay workers less and keep more of what those workers produce while they're employed. That's why the employer is always looking to see if he can hire another worker at lower pay than he pays you, if he can get rid of you altogether by substituting a machine, if he can move abroad to where the wages are much lower. All of these things which we've been living with and suffering from are a direct result of the way capitalism sets up the production process as an enmity between employer and employee. When I teach my classes, I give a simple example. Suppose once a year your family has a family reunion and you all go to a nearby park and you have a big picnic and a cookout and all of that. And each year it has to be planned. And in your family, everybody gets along except Aunt Louise and Uncle Harry. Would it make any sense that the committee set up this year to plan and organize the annual reunion of your family be a committee composed of Louise and Harry? That's crazy. You wouldn't want to have people who don't like each other, for whatever reasons, good or bad, be thrown together to do something, because that's a recipe for trouble, for conflict, for a bad planned picnic, etc. For me, capitalism is that craziness. Why do we set up something as important as the production of goods and services that we all depend on, our food, our clothing, our shelter, everything? Why do we set it up in this adversarial arrangement with workers who learn not to trust or count on the employer who's forever believing that the worker wants to spend time in the bathroom rather than working, the worker is stealing something on the way home, the worker is angry that the employer seems to be ripping him off? I mean, there is a reason why in our culture the hour or two at the end of the working day that some people spend in a bar is called the happy hour, because it underlines the fact that the hours before that aren't.
I never thought about that. That is a good one. Now, Dr. Wolff, it is, capitalism has been falsely marketed to equate capitalism, democracy, communism, anti-democratic, etc. And I think that is one of the things why, I kind of chided you about the title of your book and said, do you think this is going to really make it in these times now where the edicts of the Powell Manifesto are so much more in vogue right now? But we know that capitalism isn't really a democratic system. How do we actually let folks understand that in reality, the oppressor that the system is more oppressive than some other one?
Very important issue, very good question. Let me try to answer it this way. We are a very peculiar country, the United States, and it's just peculiar about democracy. So let's start by making sure we all are on the same page here. By democracy, I mean, and I think most people do, a system in which all of the people who are affected by a decision have the right to equally participate in making that decision. So, for example, since we're all affected by the mayor of a town we live in, who makes decisions about garbage collection and traffic patterns and things like that. Since we're all affected by what a mayor does, in our system, we all vote for the mayor. Every year or two, we go into the ballot box, and we decide whether we're happy or not with the behavior and the decisions made by the mayor. He has power over us in the decisions he makes, but we have power over him, because if we're not happy with him, we will vote him out of there. That you can call at least a electoral kind of democracy. Mm-hmm. But now let's shift the focus to the workplace. 5 out of 7 days, you go to work. You cross the threshold, you go through the doorway of your office, your factory, or your store. And now let's see how the work process is organized. Are you impacted by the decisions made by the employer? Oh boy, are you. First of all, the employer hires and fires you. So you're actually even having a job and an income is in the hands of the employer. He tells you where to sit. He tells you what machines to use. He tells you how to work. And when you're done with the job, you leave the fruits of your labor there and you go home to have a meal and to rest so you can come back and do it all again the next day. What impact do you have on the employer? Do you vote for him? Absolutely not. Is he accountable to you for the decisions he makes? Absolutely not. You are excluded from those decisions. In most corporations, a tiny group called the board of directors, usually 15 or 20 people, make the decisions. They decide what goods and services this enterprise is going to produce, what technology it's going to use, where the production is going to take place, and what is done with the profits or the revenue generated by the work all of you are doing. From these decisions that impact your life every which way, you are excluded. There is no way to describe the workplace where, again, we spend the best hours of 5 out of 7 days. There's no way to describe that as democratic. It isn't democratic. It never was democratic in capitalism. So it leads me to insist that if you want to call the United States democratic, you have to pretend that the workplace isn't there, or you have to deny everything I've just said, which is crazy because almost everyone listening to this program has an experience working and knows very well who has what kind of power and who is deprived of what kind of power in the workplace. So for me, I always have found it highly hypocritical for the United States to be running around the world claiming to be bringing democracy to the other countries when we don't have it here in something as important and dominant in our lives as the workplace where we spend most of our adult waking hours.
Now, what I love about your book is that you articulate that in a very simple way in the book. And why that is important, in my opinion, is specifically because somebody that I think that's listening to our program right now that I think should buy your book wrote the following. I have never seen my work as an adversarial relationship. In fact, unions thrive on fomenting an adversarial relationship. It's their justification for existing. Before you answer that, I just want to make mention is that is the kind of mentality that the Powell Manifesto has taught people to believe. In other words, it's not adversarial as long as you are not asking for something. Go ahead, Professor.
Right. I mean, I can understand that someone from the business point of view would dearly love to believe that the conflicts and adversarial situation that exists in almost all workplaces is something brought about by the union. But you really have to be ignorant about human history to reason that way. Every union I know of, there might be a handful of exceptions, but the overwhelming majority of unions came into existence precisely because The workers at a workplace were sick and tired of the wages they got, of the working conditions they had to live with, of the burdens of making a life that way. They turned to the union, which was a scary thing to do for most of them, which got them in trouble with the employer, which they didn't trust, I'm sure, in many cases. They turned to the unions usually out of desperation. Let me give you an example. There was one period of American history when Americans joined unions in numbers on a scale that we have never had before. We've never had it before. We've never had it since. What was that time? It was the following. It was the years 1933 to 1939. Millions of Americans who had never been in a union joined at that time. Millions of Americans whose parents had never been in a union joined at that time. Now, what is the unique fact about the period 1933 to 1939? Answer: it was the greatest depression of capitalism in its history as a system. Millions of people were out of work and desperate. So many millions. The official unemployment rate in 1933 of the government, the United States government, 25%. Every fourth worker was without a job. That means every family had at least one, if not more, people out of work. Uncle Harry, Aunt Louise, Brother Tim, Sister Sue, whatever. And that meant that that person without work had no income. Why? Because there was no unemployment insurance in 1933. There was no place to turn other than the line at the church supper if you were lucky. So what happened was people were desperate. They turned to the union because they hoped it would give them a better chance to get through the Great Depression than if they weren't in a union. That's why this time of the maximum suffering, the maximum endangerment, the maximum deprivation of working people was when they joined a union. The unions didn't cause the Great Depression because we didn't have much in the way of unions in 1929. The union movement, the modern union movement, is more a product of the Great Depression than of any other event, proving that the conflict and the difficulty that capitalism put workers into by throwing them out of work, by leaving them destitute, by wrecking virtually every family in the country, that's what drove people to a union. The unions aren't the cause of the conflict. They're the result of the fact that capitalism, left to its own devices, can't solve these problems. Every company I've known all my adult life that has wanted to avoid unions had a simple way of doing it. If you don't want a union, then give your workers what they demand and need. If you do that, they won't turn to a union. But the companies don't want to. It's just what we were discussing a few minutes ago. They don't want to give up their profits. They don't want to give up their economic growth. So they squeeze their workers, make them come earlier, make them leave later, cut back their lunch hour, drive them to work faster. All of the things that the people listening to us talk, they all know that anyway. And so it's when they keep doing that and they go over the line that the worker finally turns to the union, which he or she would not have done if it weren't for this conflictual nature of the work situation out of which the unions emerge.
The only reason you need a union, if for some reason you're not being treated fairly, and that is by it is funny that the definition that we've given capitalism, the efficient use of resources, and also the laws that have been passed in the Supreme Court that stated things like the purpose of the corporation is to maximize shareholder value. That employees don't understand that what that means is if you're maximizing somebody else's value, it has to come at your you have to be a part of that of the expense of where that is coming out of. And it is indoctrination, Dr. Wolff, as I'm sure you preach this stuff, you understand how difficult it is to break, because the past folks who, follow the doctrine of the Powell Memo and all these others have been very successful in convincing people that our economic system is divine, and unlike what you've said, whereas economic systems come and go, and when they've outlived their usefulness, it's time to go. Many people have not yet seen that.
No, I understand that, but let me give you a more hopeful angle on this.
Mm-hmm.
The last 30 or 40 years, well, let's go differently. In the 30 or 40 years after the end of World War II, from roughly 1945 to, say, the mid-70s, you had an economic boom in the United States. You had it for several reasons. Number one, you had to rebuild from the devastation of the Great Depression that lasted from 1929 to 1941. You also had to rebuild from the deprivations of World War II that came right after that, roughly 41 to 1945, So there was a boom in rebuilding not just the United States, but we got the orders, if you like, we got the demand of the rebuilding of the Europeans, who had been even more devastated by World War II than the United States. They were so devastated they couldn't rebuild their own societies, so they had to buy the machinery and the equipment from the United States, which didn't suffer during World War II in terms of bombing, to be able to rebuild. So we had a boom. We had a real big boom. And the big competitors of the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, they'd all been all destroyed in the war, so we had no competitors and an immense global market for what the United States was in the best position in the world to produce. We did real well, and it was a time when you could plausibly say to the American working class, don't bother with unions, you don't need them. Look, we're going to raise your wages 3, 4, 5% every year. Isn't it wonderful? Isn't capitalism the greatest thing since sliced bread? Because your standard of living is rising. All of the things that made unions such an important thing in American workers' lives in the 1930s and 40s were absent in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So yes, it was a time when the union movement shrank, when it was easy for employers to turn unions into bad guys, to make workers resent paying the dues that you need to pay to keep a union going, et cetera, et cetera. What we have now, though, is, again, a change. Capitalism has reverted to its old ways. It's squeezing the crap out of the average person. The standard of living has not risen. Most Americans have not recovered from the collapse of 2008. The American dream, every evidence exists, has been slipping out of reach of most Americans. So, of course, they are beginning to question the glib promise of a rising standard of living. You know, when I went to college not that long ago, I didn't have to borrow money.
Right. My children, to get a college degree, which is less valuable now than when I got it, have to go into oodles of debt, many tens of thousands of dollars hanging over them. They're not getting married when they might have otherwise done so. They are certainly not having children, and they don't doing that out of any other reason then. As they look at me, and I have a son and a daughter, each of them looks at me and says, I can't afford that. How in the world can my wife and I, or my husband and I, manage these things? You know, you don't understand, Dad, they say to me. Your situation was different. They're absolutely right. They're absolutely right. Yes, they are.
And so they're a whole generation. You tell them how wonderful capitalism is, they look at you as if you're out of your head. It isn't good. It isn't working for them. And so they're looking around, well, who can explain this? Who can... and they need the critics. And if we hadn't been so scared in America during the Cold War, we would have had a generation of people who would have been up on the criticism and be able to use the criticisms of capitalism that are as old as capitalism itself to begin to fashion solutions But we're very poor at solutions to our problem because we have excluded Marxism and other critical traditions, and so people don't have them available to use now that we need them.
Okay, sir. Last question, Dr. Wolff. Give me the solution as Dr. Richard Wolff sees it.
Okay, here's the solution. For me, most of the problems of capitalism, and by that I mean the inequality we see around us that's getting worse and worse, the instability, these periodic crashes, the real deep injustice of it all. We all know that our society will be better off the more we can educate our young people. Why then, since we all know that, do we have higher and higher costs for education, more and more borrowing, more and more difficulties? It seems as though we throw obstacles where we should be making a path. Anyway, I think capitalism's problems come from one key root, and that key root might surprise you. It's the organization of enterprises, the organization of the factories, stores, and offices, in which a tiny group of people, the owners or the board of directors if they're corporations, make all the decisions, and everybody else does what they're told. That's what we were talking about a few minutes ago. You come to the workplace, you do what you're told. No democracy at all. And I see, as an economist, a professional, looking at this all my life, I see a simple truth. If all the key decisions are in the hands of a relatively small minority, in every office, in every store, in every factory, then you really can't be surprised if the people who make these decisions, that little minority, make the kinds of decisions that make them rich and the rest of us not so much, that make them weather the instability of the system, but the rest of us not so much, that make the system look very justice-oriented to them, but to the rest of us, not so much. And so for me, the solution is democratize the enterprise. Change the enterprise so it isn't owned and operated by a small group of people, because if you want the economy to work for the people, you've got to put the people in charge of the economy. And the first and absolutely necessary step is to change the workplace. It should be democratic. It should be one vote per person, whether you're a secretary or a machinist or a truck driver or a barber or you name it. All the people in a workplace should act like a community. They should together decide what they're going to produce, how they're going to produce, where they're going to produce, and what to do with the profits. And let me give you an example of how and why that would solve our problem. If the decision about who gets paid what is made democratically, do you think the 200 workers at this factory or the 400 people working in that office would decide to give 3 or 4 people tens of millions of dollars while everybody else there can't send their kid to college because it's too expensive? That's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. Suppose a decision is to be made. Do we stay here in Cincinnati, Ohio, or do we move the factory to China where we can get away with paying lower wages? Capitalists have been doing that for the last 40 years, fit to beat the band. But a collective of workers, a democratic workplace, they'd put that up to a vote, and that would have no chance at all because they're not going to vote in favor of eliminating their own jobs. They're not going to vote in favor of moving to another part of the world to pay other people less money. This is never going to happen. The whole development of our economy, the whole way we work and live and deal with each other would be transformed if the workplace became the democratic community it should have been all along. If you want to know what I think the better system is, it's a system that gets rid of the capitalist enterprise and replaces it with a system of worker cooperatives, places where workers democratically own and operate their enterprises, take responsibility for them, and build a different society on the basis of that way of producing the goods and services we need.
And there is an example I've heard you speak about. Why don't you tell us about that? I think it's a company in Portugal or Spain. One
right?
or the other.
No, you're close. There are examples of these worker co-ops. So I am not advocating something, pie in the sky, some utopian dream that we could only see in the future. Not at all. I am describing something that already exists and has existed for a long time. Let's start with a big example and then a small one, and I'll stop. The big example, the most successful worker co-op in the world, it's called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, Mondragon, Mondragon. It's the name of a city a small city in northern Spain, in the Pyrenees Mountains that separate France from Spain. It was started in 1956 by a Roman Catholic priest named Father Arizmendi. He gave a speech to his little congregation in the Catholic Church in that very poor part of Spain, and he made a kind of a joke. He said, if we wait for an employer to come here and hire us, we will all die of old age before that happens. This is too poor. So if we're going to have jobs, which we all know we need, we're going to have to give those jobs to ourselves. In other words, let's set up a cooperative business where we, the workers who need jobs, will also be the employer. And with the help of the Roman Catholic Church that had Father Arizmendi there, they did that. Okay, 1956, long time ago. Fast forward to right now. The Mondragon Corporation has grown over these 70 years. It is now the 7th largest corporation in all of Spain. It has over 100,000 workers. The majority of them are worker owners. They are the corporation as a whole is a family of about 250 co-ops. Some of them are in manufacturing, some of them are in services. It includes one of the largest supermarket chains in all of Spain. Over those years, they competed with regular capitalist enterprises, and they won in those competitions because they proved they could do things more efficiently, etc., than those capitalist entrepreneurs. They have their own university. It's called the Mondragon University. They have their own bank. They have their own research labs. 2 American companies are so taken with the quality of the research they do that they pay the Mondragon Corporation for the right to have their American scientists working alongside their scientists in those labs in Mondragon. The name of the 2 American corporations that have these relationships with them are General Motors and Microsoft. So anyone who tells you that worker co-ops can't survive, or they can't grow, or they can't be big, or they can't compete successfully, all of that's wrong, stone cold wrong. That's not a question of theory or anything, it's a question of fact. Having said that, there are lots of co-ops in other parts of the world. Even here in the United States, there are quite a few of them. In the Bay Area in California, and then I'll stop with that, in the Bay Area of California, there are 5 bakeries. They're called the Arizmendi Bakeries, in honor of Father Arizmendi, who died many years ago. But in honor of him, as a founder, in a way, of this very successful worker co-op, these bakeries, and they include restaurants and include pizza houses and so forth in the Bay Area of California, all the workers collectively own and operate the business. They run it exactly the way Mondragon does. And the result is just one more fact. People might be entranced to understand a little bit how these enterprises work. In Mondragon, twice a year they have a meeting of all the workers to discuss the supervisors. And here's the discussion. Were the supervisors effective? Did they supervise in a humane and decent way? And at the end of the conversation, a vote is held. The workers vote whether or not to retain the supervisors. So let me get that real clear so everybody gets it. It's not the supervisor who determines whether the worker has the job. It's the other way around. Here's a second thing that happened in Mondragon that is so obvious that you really see it right away. The workers together decide on pay, and they passed a rule that's been the rule there for many years. The highest paid worker cannot get more than 8 times the lowest paid worker. Just by comparison, if you do that same study here in the United States, the average corporate CEO makes roughly 300 times what the lowest paid worker in that same corporation makes. So if you want to do something about income and wealth inequality, I mean want to do something, not talk about it. We Americans are great about talking about, oh, we're so concerned about inequality. But if you actually wanted to do something, here's the example of a society that took care of that. By having all the workers together decide on pay scales, they decided they didn't want an unequal society, and that was that. There was nothing, they didn't have to fight about it. They made that decision talking about what kind of a community it would be if some people are crazy rich and other people are scrounging around begging for a meal and all the rest scattered in between. They didn't want that kind of society, and because of worker co-ops having the power for workers, they were able to live in a community according to what they thought was best, rather than living in a community that served the profit interests of the minority of employers.
The name of the book, Understanding Marxism. Economist, author, radio show host, Dr. Richard D. Wolff. Dr. Wolff, it has been my pleasure to have you on Politics Done Right. I hope to have you on again. Thank you so kindly, sir, for the little mishap we had. I'm not sure which part of the internet went out on us. Maybe it's because of our topic. Who knows? But thank you so kindly.
Who knows? Maybe someone's sitting there with a little nasty finger. Okay.
Yeah.
It was very good to talk to you. I appreciate your show, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about these very, very important things.
You have a wonderful day, Dr. Wolff.
You too. Take care.